The desert did not forgive mistakes, and that morning it waited in silence as the sun climbed like a burning coin over the red flats, turning every shadow into a blade. When Caleb Hart found the trap by accident and the woman by fate, a giant Apache woman caught not by iron alone, but by a world that wanted her broken, her leg clamped inside a rusted bear trap half buried in dust, teeth sunk deep where flesh met bone, blood darkening the sand in slow, stubborn pulses, her body stretched against the ground like a wounded lioness refusing to bow, muscles corded, jaw set, eyes blazing with a pain that did not ask for mercy. And Caleb, cowboy, drifter, a man who had buried too many names and carried too many ghosts, froze as the wind dragged a low moan across the plain, because he knew this land, and he knew traps were never laid for bears alone. They were laid for men like him and people like her, symbols of a war that pretended it had ended, and yet there she was, taller than most men he knew, broad-shouldered and powerful even in ruin, hair black as midnight dusted with sand, a streak of dried blood down her cheek, like a war mark she had not chosen. And when she saw him, her hand went for a knife that was no longer there. Her breath came sharp, her voice a growl thick with pain and warning, telling him to step back, to leave, to run if he wanted to live, because Apache pride did not beg, and fear was a luxury she could not afford. But Caleb raised both hands slow, hat pushed back, palms empty, heart thundering, knowing one wrong word would turn this into a death, knowing that in this land kindness was often mistaken for weakness. And he spoke softly, not in the language of treaties or threats, but in the simple tone of a man who had bled and survived, telling her he wasn't there to hurt her, telling her the trap would take her leg if it stayed, telling her the desert would finish what the iron had started before the sun went down. And for a long moment she stared at him, with eyes that measured truth, the way hunters measured distance, not by hope but by consequence. And then her strength faltered just enough for him to see the truth beneath it, the tremor in her arm, the sweat beading on her brow, the pain she had been holding back like a storm behind a mountain. And Caleb moved closer, slow as sunrise, every step a gamble, the trap's chain rattling as the wind shifted, the metal jaws biting deeper when she tried not to move. And he swallowed hard because he had seen men die screaming in traps like this, had seen animals chew off their own limbs to escape, and the thought of this woman, this giant of muscle and will, being reduced to bones by vultures made something old and stubborn rise in his chest, the same thing that had once made him charge gunfire for a boy he didn't know, the same thing that had cost him a brother and a quiet life, and he knelt in the dust beside her, close enough now to smell blood and iron, and the dry sweetness of desert sage, close enough to see that the trap was old, outlaw-made, teeth filed sharp by hate, no release lever, only a brutal spring that would not forgive fingers, and she watched him with fire and suspicion, telling him if he tried to take her life she would take his first, telling him her people would hunt him until the sand forgot his name, and Caleb nodded because he believed her, because he respected that fire, and he told her the truth, that he could free her, but it would hurt worse than what she'd already known, that she might pass out, that if she did he would not leave, that he would carry her if he had to or die trying. And the desert held its breath as she made a choice no chief could command, trusting a stranger not because he was kind, but because he spoke without lies, and she gave one short nod, biting down on a strip of leather he offered, refusing the mercy of words. And Caleb worked fast, jamming a thick iron wedge he'd carried for fence posts between the jaws, muscles screaming as. He leaned his weight into it, the metal shrieking like a living thing, dust exploding as the trap resisted, her body arching as pain tore through her, a muffled scream ripping into the leather, blood spilling hotter, thicker, and then with a crack like thunder the jaws spread just enough for him to yank her leg free before the spring snapped back, the iron teeth slamming shut inches from his hand, and he fell backward in the dust, chest heaving, staring at the sky like a man who had just stolen something from death, while she lay shaking, breath ragged, face pale beneath the sunburn. And when she pulled the leather from her mouth, she did not cry. She laughed once, harsh and broken, a sound of survival, and called him a foolish man for risking his life for hers. And Caleb smiled, because foolish was a word he knew well, and he tore his shirt into strips, binding the wound tight the way his mother had taught him when he was a boy, hands steady, voice low, telling her to stay with him, telling her to curse him if it helped, telling her she was stronger than the desert and the men who laid traps in the dark. And she watched him with something new now, still guarded, still sharp, but edged with a question she had not expected to ask. Why? And Caleb did not answer because some truths did not fit in words. And when the binding was done, he slid an arm beneath her shoulders, bracing for resistance, but she let him lift her, her weight solid and real, not a myth or a symbol. And as he staggered toward his horse, every step burning, he felt the desert watching, felt the old lines of blood and law shifting beneath his boots, and he did not know that this act, this single choice made in the red dust, had already reached beyond the horizon, racing on the wind toward a camp where a chief would hear of a cowboy who did not turn away, a man who touched Apache blood without fear, a man who would be summoned not for thanks, but for a demand that would bind his fate to theirs, forever. And as the sun climbed higher and the vultures circled elsewhere, Caleb Hart carried the wounded giant toward a future he had not chosen, unaware that by saving her life, he had stepped into a story older than the land itself, a story of honor, debt, and a marriage demanded not by love, but by law, blood, and the unbreakable rules of a people who never forgot. By the next dawn, the desert had changed its voice, no longer whispering danger but humming with consequence, because Caleb Hart woke to the sound of drums rolling across the valley like distant thunder, steady and deliberate, not the rhythm of war, but the heartbeat of a people who had come to collect a debt. And when he stepped out of his small canvas shelter with sleep still heavy in his bones, he saw them, Apache warriors standing in a wide half-circle, silent, mounted and on foot, their presence filling the land the way mountains filled the sky, and at their center stood the woman he had saved, her leg bound and supported by a carved staff, her posture unbroken despite pain, her eyes calm now, no longer the fire of a trapped animal, but the steel of someone who had survived and remembered. And beside her stood the chief, tall and weathered, face lined like an old canyon, eyes sharp with years of judgment. And Caleb's hand twitched toward his belt out of instinct before he stopped himself, knowing weapons meant nothing here, knowing his life was already being weighed. And the woman spoke first, her voice carrying across the dust, telling her people this was the man, the one who broke the iron, the one who could have left her to die but chose not to, the one who touched Apache blood and did not turn away. And a murmur moved through the warriors like wind through grass, not anger, not praise, but recognition, because among her people a life saved was not a favor, it was a bond. And the chief stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Caleb's face, and spoke in a voice that did not rise or fall, telling him that the trap had been laid by men who feared strength they could not control, telling him that the woman was not only a warrior but his daughter, the last born of his line, known among her people as stone in the river, unmovable once set. And Caleb felt the weight of that truth settle into his chest, heavier than any saddle, because he understood then that this was no simple rescue. And the chief continued, explaining the law older than treaties and fences, a law written in survival, that when an outsider saved the life of a chief's child, he did not walk away unchanged, because blood demanded balance, and balance demanded binding, and Caleb listened as the words fell like stones, each one shaping a fate he had not imagined, until the chief spoke the demand plain and without ornament. Caleb Hart would marry his daughter, not as punishment, not as reward, but as fulfillment of honor, tying his life to theirs, so the debt could never rot into resentment. And the desert seemed to lean closer, waiting, and Caleb's mouth went dry, his thoughts racing through everything he would lose and everything he did not understand, his freedom, his wandering, the quiet distance he kept from people, because loving them meant burying them. And he tried to speak, to argue, to explain that he was no man for a chief's daughter, that he carried ghosts and bad luck like scars. But the woman, stone in the river, raised her hand, and the camp fell silent again. And she looked at him not with command but with choice, telling him she would not be given to a coward or a liar, telling him that if he refused he would be allowed to leave alive, but the debt would follow him in dreams. And Caleb saw then that this was not a cage but a crossroads, and he thought of the trap, of iron teeth closing, of a life nearly erased, because someone decided she did not belong, and something inside him hardened into clarity, because all his life he had run from roots, from belonging, from standing still long enough to be claimed. And yet here he was, already claimed by an act he could not undo, and he nodded once, slow and final, accepting not because he understood, but because honor had saved him before when nothing else had. And the chief studied him a long moment before nodding back, the circle breaking into movement, drums shifting rhythm, not celebration but transition. And over the next hours, Caleb was led into a world he had only seen from the outside, a camp alive with work and watchfulness, women grinding corn, children pausing to stare at the strange cowboy who would now be family, elders watching him with eyes that missed nothing, and Stone in the River walked beside him, explaining their ways in few words, telling him marriage here was not romance sung by fools, but partnership forged by survival, telling him she did not need saving again and would never kneel. And Caleb found himself smiling despite fear, because for the first time in years he stood next to someone who did not ask him to be smaller. And when the ceremony came, it was simple and heavy with meaning. No priest, no papers, only vows spoken before fire and witnesses, binding breath to breath, path to path. And as Caleb placed his hand over hers, he felt the truth settle. Not that he had been trapped, but that he had finally stopped running, and days turned into weeks, and the world did not end as he had feared. Instead, it widened, because he learned their land, their stories, their scars, and they learned his. And when men came again laying traps and spreading fear, they did not find a lone cowboy or an isolated tribe. They found a line drawn in sand and stone, and Caleb stood in it not as a stranger, but as a husband, a warrior by choice. And Stone in the River stood beside him, leg healed, strength undimmed, and the desert watched as balance was restored not through bloodshed but through unity. And years later, when stories were told around fires, they did not speak first of the marriage or the chief's demand. They spoke of a man who saw a trap and chose to break it, and how that single act changed more than one life, changing a future, changing a people, changing him. And if this story moved you, if you believe one brave choice can rewrite destiny, then remember, stories like this live only when they are shared. So subscribe to the channel